Hello everyone, myself Deepak Gupta, and in this session we will take up the topic of commonly known as LPG. L that is liberalization, P that is privatization, and G denotes the globalization. So these three words actually denotes the key pillars of the new economic policy which was announced when India was standing on the verge of collapse economically at least in the year 1991. And that was also the phase where the old regime, which was there in existence for the period from 1950 to 1990, which is commonly known as Nehruvian economic model, and which will have pros and cons as per the political alignments of the various people. But what side effects of this economic policy, of what huge burdens this economic policy have put on the country, they have just contributed this stage that we were standing at the gates of the IMF and World Bank like a beggar because they need to give us funds so that we are able to save our economy. And when someone wants to give something, then he will do so at his own conditions, which though may look absurd, but sometimes they're necessary to keep us out of the shackles. So, the primary and the main reason of India's such poor state of economy at the end of the 1990 was that before we got independent, we were just used as a feeder economy by the British. That is, all our resources were taken by the British to feed their queen and to strengthen their British economy. So they just destroyed the economic character of our country. They destroyed the agriculture sector by substituting the food crops with the cash crops. They destroyed the industrial sector firstly by destroying the existing handicraft industries and then providing no support to any other industry to be set up. They destroyed the foreign trade by substituting the import of finished goods and export of the raw material. So what they did that we started exporting the raw material, though ideally we should have been exporting the finished goods. And we started importing the finished goods, though ideally we should have been importing the raw material. So they just reversed our foreign trade. So agriculture, industrial, and the foreign trade, which were the three key horses to run an economy, were actually fully destroyed by the British for their own benefits. And this has already been discussed in our first session on Indian economic development, that is the British period till 1947, 1950, as you said. But then we launched the second phase of our growth, and because we were so shy of the of the capitalist economy because British came to us as a company, so we didn't accepted the capitalist economy, and we could not afford the socialist economy because the government was like not in a position to set up all the industries. So we put up that mixed economy, but with the mindset, so we opted for mixed economy that we will support both the government as well as the private sector. But our mindset was purely, or I should say, aggressively socialist. So there were a huge license raj. So this huge licensing policy and over, uh, we should say, कि आपने government sector name, it was over dominant by the government sector. So most of the crucial sectors which were growth oriented were taken over or but handled by the government either directly through Schedule A or through Schedule B through the licensing. And therefore, the private sector growth was almost nullified. And therefore, to uh, support or improve the position of poverty and unemployment, government got into huge public debts, and that along with the high level of corruption and inefficiency just put us at the stage of 1991, where we have to adapt to the IMF conditions, which primarily said that you will have to liberate, you will have to privatize, and you will have to globalize. So, what we will be doing in this session, that we will first identify the reasons. Okay? We will first identify the reasons, that is, these are the reasons for economic reforms, or we could also say that these are the primary loopholes or the side effects or the negative effects of the economic model primarily adopted by the Congress in 1990. And then we were forced to adapt this new economic policy as advised by the IMF and the World Bank through the steps of LPG, and then we will understand what this LPG denotes. But before we move on, that conceptually liberalization is like you have to reduce government control. Privatization actually denotes that opening ownership and various sectors to private sector. That is, more and more private sector can be a part of the industry, and the globalization denotes entry of foreign companies. Or we can say that globalization is reduction on restrictions on foreign players. So, first of all, we should focus on the reasons. Just a moment. So, the various reasons which can be underlined, the first and foremost is that government created public sector. That is basically it enter into almost every business domain. यहाँ तक कि जो लोग ब्रेड खाते थे, ब्रेड के लिए भी गवर्नमेंट की कंपनी थी मॉडर्न इंडस्ट्रीज। अब उसकी ब्रेड के कंपैरिजन में अगर कुछ था ही नहीं, तो आउटपुट इतनी कम थी कि लोगों को ब्रेड नहीं मिलती थी। तो ब्रेड नाम का प्रोडक्ट तो था, लेकिन बिकॉज ऑफ इनएफिशिएंसी उसकी आउटपुट बहुत कम थी, उसकी टाइमली सप्लाई नहीं थी। सो पीपल, उसकी जो क्वालिटी थी, दैट वाज सो पुअर that people were actually fed up with the quality. So that modern bread was going into shackles, not because there was no demand for the product, but because of the inefficiency and the corruption and other factors of the company itself. So because of, and this is just an example, there were so many companies, and we should say most of the companies were so working in the same manner that there was huge disappointment from the public sector, and therefore we can say that it was in very poor condition because of their poor performance, and therefore there were huge accumulated losses. So it is like inefficiency था, ओवर एम्प्लॉयमेंट था, लोगों की अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट की समस्या खत्म करने के लिए गवर्नमेंट ने लोगों को जबरदस्ती नौकरी पर रख लिया, वो अपनी आउटपुट नहीं दे रहे, काम नहीं कर रहे। तो जो टैक्स पेयर का पैसा था, दैट वाज ऑल नॉर्मली गोइंग इनटू दिस सैलरी, एंड वी कैन से दैट मोस्ट ऑफ द मनी given to such public sector companies were wasted. So what was happening actually, that government incur these losses and use the taxpayers' money to pay off their losses, and instead of improving the performance of the public sector, they just kept on carrying on these public sector units, and that is why this poor performance of the public sector was one of the primary reasons that prompted to move towards new economic policy. Similarly, there has to be a proper balance of payment. And when we use the word balance of payment, then we should understand that when we export, then there is a receipt of foreign exchange. And when we import, then there is payment of foreign exchange. So ideally, this R and this P, ideally R should be more than P, or it could have been equal. But if it goes reverse way, then there is a deficit. And this difference of the two is what you call the balance of payment primarily. So we were having huge deficit of balance of payment, which underlines that we were having huge imports. So it implied that we were having high imports. Imports तो आपके बहुत ज़्यादा थे और बहुत कम आपके एक्सपोर्ट्स थे. अब एक्सपोर्ट्स तब होंगे जब डोमेस्टिक इंडस्ट्री स्ट्रांग होगी, आपके प्रोडक्ट्स की डिमांड होगी, क्वालिटी होगी, और क्वालिटी होगी तो डिमांड खुद ब खुद जनरेट होगी. तो अगर आप इंडस्ट्री सेटअप करोगे तो आपके प्रोडक्ट्स की डिमांड होगी, प्रोडक्ट्स की डिमांड होगी तो आपके एक्सपोर्ट्स बढ़ेंगे, एक्सपोर्ट्स बढ़ेंगे तो आपकी बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट की डेफिसिट कम होगी, एंड द कंपनी विल हैव सफिशिएंट फॉरेन एक्सचेंज रिजर्व्स. एंड दैट वाज नॉट हैपनिंग. वी वर जस्ट standing at almost, we should say, bankruptcy in the terms of foreign exchange. And if you see now at today's news, or if you just track the economic news in today's times, then you will find that India's foreign exchange reserves have increased by this much, have increased by this much. So there is a huge inflow of the foreign investments, and imports are quite high. Imports have been put on to only requisite items, essential items, more or less, and that is why we are having record foreign exchange reserves, and you can always see the impact. Then, in spite of such an economy, such an economic turmoil in the world, India is even at this stage in the path of the growth and one of the highest growing economy in the world. And the main reason is, I should say, is the less deficit of the balance of payment. So I cannot say that we don't have the deficit at the moment, but still it is quite low as compared to what it was, where we were standing at the verge of bankruptcy. Similarly, Similarly, there was huge inflation. And if you understand, we say the word that inflationary pressure was there. As we all understand, inflation, that is महंगाई, comes from high demand. And not just high demand, it also comes from low supply. So what is happening, that because the industrial output was low, or more of the industries were not working, and the public sector was working inefficiently, the supply of the goods was low, and that is why there were huge inflation. And this inflationary pressure always causes the economy to collapse. Similarly, as of the implications of the balance of payment, we have discussed that foreign exchange reserves were real low. There was huge fall in the foreign exchange reserves, and this has already been discussed, so there is no point of discussion again on the topic. Similarly, when you don't have good exports, you don't have industrial output, that is why the tax collection by the government will go down. And even if your collection is low and you're not spending on the growth plans, you have to do the permanent administrative expenditures. So what was happening, that out of the revenue, government has to spend on the development expenditure and the administrative expenditure and the capital expenditure. So because the revenue was low, neither there were any expenditure on the development, neither there were capital expenditure, and the government was rarely able to maintain its operating expenditures. So India felt that there was almost no development, there was no capital expenditure, and even the revenue was so low that to maintain the basic items we have to raise debt. So the debt became huge and huge and huge because of low revenues which came from the taxation, and because of the lack of the industrial output, the taxation's collection were so less. So, and last item that we have already discussed as per the books is the inefficient management. So this inefficient management, it not just on the aspect of the public sector undertakings, it denotes the overall government procedure. Because you started your growth journey with the preparation of 5-year plans, and for that you created the planning commission. So either they were flawed or they were not able to identify their flaw and take corrective action, or not able to take the corrective action. Similarly, the finance ministers or the bureaucrats which were responsible for the economic condition of the country were either inefficient or they were lenient because they didn't took corrective action on time. So overall, the government failed on the economic front to take corrective actions timely. So we should not say that they just failed on the timely correction method, but they also failed to identify the reasons. And if someone is not able to identify the reasons, then he cannot take corrective action, not even late. So these things impacted the uh, financial growth of the country hugely, and that is why we were forced to enter into the new economic policy. And this new economic policy has the first step as liberalization. This has had the first step as liberalization. So if we move towards that, so we will see that though there were three-step requirement: liberalization, privatization, and globalization, but our focus at the moment is liberalization, which, as per the words of the book, we write it, denotes the removal of entry. किस इंडस्ट्री पे आप आओगे कि नहीं आओगे, एंड ग्रोथ, रिमूवल ऑफ एंट्री एंड ग्रोथ रेस्ट्रिक्शंस का मतलब सिंपल भाषा में ऑन द प्राइवेट सेक्टर. फर्स्ट आई शुड राइट द डेफिनेशन. तो जैसे आपको पता है कि आपने 1990 तक इंडस्ट्रीज को वो तीन जगह बांटा: टायर 1, टायर 2 एंड टायर 3. टायर 1 वाज स्पेसिफाइड फॉर द गवर्नमेंट, टायर 2 वाज for the private sector but with the permission of the government, and tier 3 was for the private sector, but that too requires various permissions, that is commonly known as license raj. So what was done, that for the tier 1 industry there was no growth for the private sector, and for tier 2 and tier 3 there was licensing, and this licensing was the biggest threat, or was the biggest roadblock for industrial growth. It hampered the entry and the growth plans of the industries. It hampered both of them. So, as a first step towards liberalization, the first step, the first and foremost step of the process of liberalization has to be the removal and easing of licensing. कि हर चीज में जो परमिशन चाहिए, लाइसेंसिंग चाहिए, जहां जहां हो सके हटा दो, और अगर कहीं आपको लगता है कि अभी बिल्कुल नहीं हटा सकते क्योंकि वो स्ट्रेटेजिक एरियाज हैं, कोर एरियाज हैं जहां गवर्नमेंट को अपना कंट्रोल चाहिए, वहां पर उस लाइसेंसिंग को ईज ऑफ करा जाए. सो गवर्नमेंट टुक्स वेरियस स्टेप्स, तो बहुत सारी इंडस्ट्री को T1 से निकाल के T2 और T3 में डाल दिया गया। T3 की बहुत सारी इंडस्ट्रीज से लाइसेंसिंग की प्रोसीजर खत्म कर दी गई, और T2 के अंदर जब क्वांटिटी बढ़ गई इंडस्ट्रीज की, क्योंकि T1 वाली बहुत सारी T2 और T3 में चली गई, तो T1 से गवर्नमेंट कंट्रोल कम हो गया, T3 की लाइसेंसिंग मोरलेस खत्म हो गई, और T2 के अंदर इंडस्ट्रीज बढ़ गई, और उसमें भी लाइसेंसिंग की जो प्रक्रिया थी वो काफी हद तक हटा दी गई, रिमूव कर दी गई, एंड दैट ऑल contributed to the liberalization. So how the liberalization was done? That the first step was the removal or easing of the licensing. Then, as a second step, we reduced the role of public sector to the minimum. At least the objective was that. So what you did, you started opening new public sector units, and you acted on the closure of the current public sector units which were on the brink of collapse, and such public sector undertakings were identified as sick industrial units and they were closed. So government, as much in their capacities, reduced the public sectors to the extent possible by not entering into any new areas, and also closing as much sectors as possible which were incurring huge losses. So only the core areas such as defense, railways, and only the areas which were profitable such as communication through BSNL, MTNL, or VSNL, they were kept, so that we are not carrying on with the loss-making public sector undertaking. Similarly, we took constructive efforts. We took constructive efforts for small scale industries. We took constructive efforts for the small scale industries. So, what does that denote? That because we believe, and I think it is a thought of every economic uh, country which is on the development stage, that small industries are the basic threads on which our economy will grow. So all developing economies has to stretch this small scale exercise thread. And if we understand this exercise thread and we support them, then it will increase the industrial output, and these SSI will someday become the large industries, leading to the industrialization of our country. So government tried to remove more or less bottlenecks for the working of the SSIs. They provided them easy loans, and also they increased the turnover criterion for the SSI, so that more and more units come into the criterion of SSI to avail the benefits. So SSI sector was strengthened to its maximum. Some, Similarly, there was an act known as MRTP Act, that is Monopolistic and Restrictive Trade Policies Act. So before we move to that we should understand that liberalization was undertaken into various sectors, and these steps were primarily taken in the industrial sector. Similarly, similar steps were taken not just in the industrial sector but in the foreign trade sector, in the economic sector, in the taxation sector, and we will discuss them all one by one in the sessions to come. But before I move further, that we should first understand this MRTP, that we say that monopoly of any industry in any economy is never good for the consumer, also not for the country. Because whenever industry works in a monopoly, then it may cause inefficiency, it may cause price burden to the consumer, and therefore there must, it provides obviously the lack of choice. So no country, no healthy economy, no healthy democratic economy, we should say, should allow monopoly. So there has to be multiple players in every sector. But when there are multiple players, then it creates a sense of competition and risk for the industry itself. So it may happen that a particular industry which is strong enough will try to remove the new small players to the extent as much as possible so that there are lesser players and so it is having less competition which helps in maintaining the price of its choice, and therefore such industries can acquire hostilely these companies, and therefore the MRTP Act was created, which basically took a toll on various acquisitions and amalgamations because the government felt that it can lead to the monopolistic business practices. Also, such big industries may restrict by using their business connections the trade activities of such small industries. So, if any case of such things were found, then MRTP Act was applicable, and such industries involved in certain actions like which were not allowed to be done were fined under the MRTP Act. So, this MRTP Act basically we should say, acted as a huge burden for amalgamations and demergers, and which having a side effect stopped the industrial reconstruction and hence the growth of the businesses. Therefore, this much stringent MRTP Act was replaced by a more practical Competition Act. Though it was created in the year 2002, it took time to come into existence. But this MRTP Act was replaced by the Competition Act, which was much lenient and not so stringent, and which allowed mergers and acquisitions, not to the extent that they were uh, derogatory for the small scale industries. So, in this way, we can say that liberalization was the first step of the new economic policy, which aimed to remove all bottlenecks of the previous economic model, and hence it was the first step to stop the bankruptcy and the poor financial position of the country. We will discuss further in this matter. On this note, we close this.